Welcome to the bookstore. Today's book summary is on the novel, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. War and Peace begins in 1805 and follows five noble families as their fates intertwine. During the Napoleonic Wars, the families are: First family, the Bezukhovs, Count Kirill Bezukhov, a rich count who dies at the beginning of the novel, and his illegitimate son Pierre. Second family, the Rostovs, financially struggling, led by Count Rostov and his wife, Countess Rostov. They have four children: snippy Vera, romantic Nikolai, beautiful Natasha, and boisterous Pyotr. They have also taken in Sonia Rostov, a young, orphaned cousin a few years older than Natasha. Third family, the Balkuskis, a wealthy family that lives at Bald Hills, their rural estate. They are led by the aging, eccentric Nikolai Bolkonsky. They include Prince Andrei, who is aloof and ambitious, his pious younger sister, Princess Maria, as well as Andrei's wife Lise and Maria's companion, Mashal Boryan. Andrei and Lise have a son, Nikolai, or Nikolushka, at the beginning of the book. Fourth family, the Karagins, led by the intelligent and calculating Prince Vasily and his three uncouth children, Hippolyte, Anatole, and Helene. Fifth family, the Drubetskoys, another financially insolvent family. They consist of the scheming, middle-aged Princess Drubetskoy and her son Boris, a relentless social climber. Now let's stat with the novel. Volume 1. It is 1805 and Russia is at war with Napoleon Bonaparte's France. Tolstoy introduces many of the characters at a soirée held by Anna Pavlovna Shearer, a St. Petersburg socialite. This party marks 20-year-old Pierre Bezukhov's first entrance into society because he has studied abroad since he was a child, and was born an illegitimate son. Although he is smart, he fails to impress the party guests because he is so absent-minded and awkward. Prince Vasily Kuragin tries to broker a marriage between his son Anatole and Princess Maria Bolkonsky. Prince Andrei announces that he's joining the army as a high-ranking adjutant, and leaving behind his pregnant wife. The Rostov family holds a banquet. Everyone is impressed by young Natasha Rostov's beauty and grace. 18-year-old Nikolai decides to join the hussars in a fit of patriotism. Natasha is in love with Boris Drubetskoy, and Nikolai is in love with his impoverished cousin Sonia. Both couples promise to marry each other when the men get back from the war. Over the next few weeks, Pierre has a great time carousing in St. Petersburg with, among other people, the Kuragin sons. This ends when his father dies of a stroke. Because he is illegitimate, Pierre must struggle with Vasily Kuragin over who will inherit his father's estate. Pierre eventually wins out and becomes one of the richest men in Russia. Princess Drubetskoy manages to ingratiate herself with both Pierre and the Karagins. Meanwhile, Prince Andrei prepares to go to war, to the chagrin of his father, wife, and sister. The next part of the volume takes place on the battlefield in Austria. Tolstoy introduces Dolokhov, a sadistic friend of Anatole Kuragin. Prince Andrei and Kutuzov must deal with their capricious allies, the Austrians, in addition to fighting the French. Nikolai Rostov bonds with a new friend, Captain Denisov, when a soldier steals from Denisov. Nikolai is terrified after fighting in his first battle, and both Nikolai and Andrei realize that war is not what they had hoped it would be. Pierre marries Helene Kuragin under pressure from Petersburg society. Anatole Kuragin visits Bald Hills to propose to Princess Maria, but this falls through after he has a short-lived liaison with Mashal Boryan. Andrei's wife, Lise, has a son, Nikolushka, also Nikolai, after his grandfather, and dies in childbirth. Nikolai sees the Tsar, and becomes obsessed with him and the fatherland he represents. At the epic Battle of Austerlitz, Andrei is wounded and taken to a French hospital. Nikolai develops a taste for heroism, just as Andrei is becoming completely disillusioned with war. Volume 2. Nikolai brings Captain Denisov home when they are on leave, and Denisov falls in love with Natasha. She rejects his marriage proposal. There is a rumor that Elene Bezukov has had an affair with Dolokhov, so Pierre challenges Dolokhov to a duel. Pierre wounds Dolokhov but can't bring himself to kill the injured man. This causes a violent fight between Pierre and his wife, and they end up separating. Nikolai gambles with Dolokhov and loses much of his family's fortune. Pierre joins the Freemasons. Prince Andrei dedicates himself to spending time with his son while farming on his family's rural estate. Pierre ostentatiously tries to improve the lives of his peasants, but fails because he doesn't have the business sense to make real changes. It is now 1807, and Russia calls a truce with France. Elene Bezukov has an affair with Boris Drubetskoy, who has rapidly elevated himself in society through networking and hard work. Nikolai Rostov and Boris are both present when Tsar Alexander meets with Napoleon to sign the peace treaty. Prince Andrei visits Count Rostov and begins to fall in love with Natasha. Shortly after this, he is hired as a commissioner for the government's efforts at internal reform. He eventually becomes disillusioned with this job when he realizes the reform efforts are inefficient and insincere. Pierre takes his wife back and is surprised to find that Elene has become a very successful socialite. Natasha and Boris no longer want to marry each other. Vera Rostov marries a lieutenant. At a grand New Year's Eve ball, Natasha meets Prince Andrei and stuns him with her youth and good looks. Andrei proposes to Natasha despite his father's wishes. Because Natasha is so young, the families agree to a one-year engagement, during which Natasha will be free to break things off if she wishes. It is now 1810. Nikolai, Natasha, and Pyotr Rostov go hunting on their country estate and admire the lifestyle of their uncle, who lives in the countryside. Despite some doubts, Nikolai Rostov decides he still wants to marry Sonia and reiterates his promise to her. Pierre Bezukov suffers a spiritual crisis because the Masons leave him feeling unfulfilled. The elder prince Nikolai Bolkonsky becomes senile and gets in the habit of verbally abusing his daughter Maria, who tries her best to care for him. Boris Drubetskoy courts both Maria and her best friend Julie Karagin. He marries Julie despite his better judgment. Natasha makes a bad first impression with her future in-laws, Prince Nikolai and Princess Maria. She falls in love with Anatole Kuragin and breaks off her engagement to Prince Andrei. Just as she is about to elope with Anatole, a family friend, Maria Dmitrievna Akrosimov, stops her. Anatole runs away rather than facing Natasha's family. Natasha tries to poison herself, but recovers. Pierre falls in love with Natasha, but becomes a reliable platonic friend. Instead of taking advantage of her vulnerability, he sees the Great Comet of 1811. Volume 3. Russia and France go to war again. Prince Andrei is deeply hurt by Natasha's betrayal, and refuses to take her back. The Tsar offers him a high-ranking military job, but Andrei rejects it so he can lead an army regiment. Nikolai participates in battle and is horrified when he nearly kills a French dragoon. Natasha's experience with Anatole sobers her and she becomes solemn and pious. Although this change is short-lived, Pierre continues to love her from afar. 15-year-old Pyotr Rostov tries to see Tsar Alexander when the latter comes to Moscow. He is nearly crushed by the crowd. He is so determined to join the army that his family allows him to enlist. Pierre, alienates society with his liberal, pacifist opinions. General Kutuzov becomes commander-in-chief of the military. When the French approach, the Balkuskis evacuate Bald Hills, with the exception of Andrei, who is with the army. When they get to their country estate, the elder Prince Nikolai dies of a stroke and the mujiks, Russian peasants, revolt and imprison Princess Maria. Nikolai Rostov happens to be passing with his company, and he rescues her. They begin to fall in love, although Nikolai feels conflicted because he's already promised to marry Sonia. In one of the novel's most famous scenes, Pierre tries to participate in the Battle of Borodino but ends up walking aimlessly around the battlefield. Prince Andrei is gravely wounded in this battle. As the French advance on Moscow, most of the city's population evacuates. Meanwhile, Helene Bezukhov contemplates leaving Pierre for another man, although she doesn't know which suitor to marry. While evacuating Moscow, the Rostovs lose many of their possessions when they agree to use their carts to transport wounded officers instead of their own belongings. Prince Andrei is among the wounded officers. Pierre is so inspired by the common soldiers he sees at Borodino that he disguises himself as a peasant and sneaks into Moscow, hoping to murder Napoleon. Instead, he becomes a good Samaritan and helps a number of people, including a French captain, a woman being assaulted, and a little girl lost in a burning house. The French misunderstand what he's doing and arrest him. The French capture Moscow. Volume 4. Helene Bezukhov dies of illness. Nikolai Rostov meets Princess Maria again in the provinces and begins to negotiate a marriage with her, despite his promise to Sonia. Meanwhile, Countess Rostov persuades Sonia to free Nikolai from his promise, since she doesn't want her son to marry a woman with no dowry. The French imprison Pierre and force him to watch an execution. He meets a simple, religious peasant named Platon Karatayev, who inspires him to live simply and value faith in God above all else. Natasha realizes that the wounded Prince Andrei is with her family and nurses him tenderly. Princess Maria also hears about this and rushes to see her injured brother. Andrei dies shortly after she arrives. At the Battle of Tarutino, the tide of the war turns against the French and they begin to retreat. The French leave Moscow, taking their 30,000 prisoners of war, including Pierre, with them. After the French surrender, Russian partisans continue to attack the retreating troops. Denisov leads one of these groups, which also includes Dolokhov and Pyotr Rostov. Denisov's company raids a French camp and frees Pierre and their other prisoners of war. However, Pyotr is shot in the head and dies during the action. In the wake of Andrei and Pyotr's deaths, Natasha becomes close friends with Princess Maria. Pierre finally learns about his wife's death and that of his friend Prince Andrei. He becomes gravely ill but recovers. Between his illness and his long imprisonment, he becomes a changed man, altruistic, level-headed, and spiritually content. He visits Princess Maria and the Rostovs to give them his condolences. He realizes he's still in love with Natasha. He proposes to Natasha and they marry. They have a wonderful relationship and Natasha matures into a humble and dedicated mother. Nikolai Rostov marries Princess Maria, and Sonia lives with them as a kind of servant. Nikolai and Maria have a turbulent relationship. Tolstoy concludes the novel with an epilogue in which he meditates about the relationship between individuals and history. Epilogue. Picking up right up where we left off. Pierre and Natasha get married. Sadly, Count Rostov soon dies and Nikolai comes home to see that the estate is bankrupt and they are totally in the poorhouse. Meanwhile, Countess Rostov is borderline senile and needs to be kept in the same high-class lifestyle she's grown accustomed to. Nikolai is basically up crap creek, taking care of everyone and being miserable. Since saving her, Nikolai has been in love with Maria, but he now thinks marriage is out of the question because of his poverty. Maria doesn't think that's a problem, so they get married. The Rostov family is saved by Maria's giant inheritance. Now Nikolai, Maria, Countess Rostov, and Sonia all live together at Maria's estate, and Nikolai turns out to have a good head for estate management. He quickly pays off his dad's debts and starts making money. He also gets into agriculture and learns how to treat his serfs well, so they treat the land well. Both couples have good marriages. And we get to see up close and personal how they negotiate power roles, parenting responsibilities, and how they deal with disagreements and miscommunications. It's like a self-help manual all of a sudden. At the end, there's a big argument between Pierre and Nikolai about how Emperor Alexander has gotten sucked into religion and has basically left the country in the hands of some crazy reactionaries. Pierre hints that he might be down with regime change, but Nikolai is totally devoted to Alexander and would never oppose him. The end shows Nikolenka, Andrei's son, thinking about doing something great with his life and also about how much he adores his godfather, Pierre. That's a hint that they might be part of the Decembrist uprising, a failed attempt to assassinate the emperor. Well, that's the end of the characters, but not the end of the book. Next we get a really long essay in which Tolstoy denounces the way historians were writing history at the time. History had always been seen as the story of a few individuals. Everything can be explained by finding the great man who made things happen. Tolstoy instead urges historians to see events in the context of all the other events that came before. He argues that even the lowliest people influence history. Basically, he's advocating the kind of historical writing that has become the modern standard way to anticipate Tolstoy. So here we come to the end of this book. Summary. Thank you for listening to the bookstore. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and like the video. Later.